Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know, we love to get into the nitty-gritty of things that really matter, and today we're tackling a topic that's foundational to, well, pretty much everything: motivation.
Absolutely. And this isn't just about getting yourself pumped up for a workout or finishing that big project, although, of course, that's part of it.
Right. This deep dive goes much deeper. We're talking about what really drives us as human beings, both in our personal lives and in our work. And to help unpack all of this, we're turning to a book you flagged that really resonated with you: Susan Fowler's Why Motivating People Doesn't Work and What Does.
Yeah, such a catchy title, right? I mean, it makes you stop and think, well, if motivating people doesn't work, what on earth does?
Hmm.
And that's exactly the question Fowler sets out to answer.
And let me add, Fowler isn't just some armchair philosopher.
No, not at all.
The book, especially the second edition that came out in 2023, is built on years of solid research and practical application in the field of motivation science.
It's not just theory. It's about what actually works in the real world.
And it's interesting that Gary Ridge, the former CEO of WD-40 Company, wrote the foreword to the book.
WD-40, that company that makes the, well, WD-40.
Right.
But what's fascinating is that Ridge highlights how WD-40's incredible success, it really mirrors the principles that Fowler lays out in the book.
Hmm.
It's about creating a culture where people feel inspired, safe, and have a sense of fulfillment through choice, connection, and competence.
Okay, so before we get lost in all the details, let's step back for a minute and talk big picture.
Okay.
What's the central argument Fowler's making here? What's the core message we need to grasp?
Well, at its heart, Fowler argues that people are already motivated.
Wait, hold on. So we're already motivated,
Right.
but we still struggle to get things done, to feel energized, to stick with our goals.
Precisely. And that's where the real challenge lies. Our existing motivation might not be aligned with what we or our bosses actually want us to be doing.
So it's not a lack of motivation, but a mismatch of motivation.
Exactly. And Fowler goes on to say that when we try to force motivation from the outside, using those classic carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments, we actually often end up undermining the very qualities we need for true, sustained effort and excellence.
It's like we're trying to control the river instead of understanding its natural flow.
That's a great analogy.
So Fowler's book offers an entirely different framework, one that's based on recognizing and nurturing those internal drivers that are already there within us.
Yeah, and this challenges a lot of conventional thinking about motivation.
It sure does. So let's jump right into one of those big challenges, the classic idea of using external rewards, the carrots and sticks, to motivate people. What does Fowler have to say about that?
She really digs into this, the whole pecking pigeon paradigm, as she calls it. Research has shown that while people might accept the offered rewards, there's often a negative correlation between those external incentives and their actual performance.
So giving people bonuses or prizes might not actually make them perform better. In fact, it could make things worse.
That's what the research suggests.
Wow. That really turns a lot of what we think we know about motivation on its head. I mean, so many organizations are built around these kinds of external motivators.
Exactly. Fowler talks about this whole industry built on what she calls pellets. Those external rewards, everything from complex compensation systems to Employee of the Month awards.
But if the science is questioning the effectiveness of these systems, then what?
Well, Fowler uses this great example of Billy Beane from Moneyball, the guy who revolutionized baseball.
Oh, yeah, the movie with Brad Pitt.
Right, exactly. So Beane famously turned down a huge salary offer for the Boston Red Sox, which was like an unheard of amount of money at the time.
And his reasoning.
His mother later shared that his decision was guided by his deeper values,
Yeah.
his commitment to his family, and his love for the game of baseball, things that mattered far more to him than just a bigger paycheck.
That's a powerful example. So if external rewards aren't the answer, what are they? I know Fowler calls them motivational junk food. What does she mean by that?
Well, it's a great metaphor, right? Those incentives, those rewards, that external recognition, they're like junk food for our motivation.
They give us a temporary boost, but no real substance.
Exactly. They offer that quick burst of excitement, but they don't provide any lasting nutritional value for our deeper, more intrinsic motivation. In fact, over time, they can actually distract us from those more meaningful sources of drive that lead to lasting fulfillment and sustainable performance.
Okay, so if the external stuff is the junk food, what's the healthy, sustaining meal in Fowler's world? I know she talks about this spectrum of motivation. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So the spectrum of motivation, it's this model that outlines 6 distinct motivational outlooks. And these range from what she calls suboptimal to optimal motivation.
Suboptimal and op.
All right, think of it like a scale, yeah. So on the suboptimal end, we have what she calls disinterested. Basically, you're not motivated at all. Then there's external, where your actions are driven by external pressures or the promise of some reward. And then there's imposed, where you're doing something out of guilt or fear of letting someone down.
So those are the less healthy motivations.
Right, the less healthy ones. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, the optimal side, we have aligned motivation. This is where your actions align with your personal values. You feel good about what you're doing.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then there's inherent motivation, where you're engaged in something you actually enjoy for its own sake.
Yeah.
It's intrinsically rewarding.
Like a hobby you love.
Exactly. And finally, we have integrated motivation, which is the most optimal state. Here, your motivation is completely internalized. It's aligned with your sense of self and your identity. It's like who you are is expressed through what you're doing.
So it's not just about being motivated, it's about the quality of that motivation.
Yeah.
Why we're doing what we're doing.
Exactly. And recognizing these different outlooks, both in ourselves and in the people we work with or lead, it's essential for actually getting things done and for creating a more fulfilling work environment.
And it's not always easy to figure out where someone is on that spectrum, right? It's not like we wear a badge that says, hey, I'm externally motivated today.
Right. Fowler shares this great anecdote about a top-performing salesperson named Casey who wins a spa week as a reward for her hard work. You'd think she'd be thrilled, right?
A free spa week, who wouldn't love that?
Well, it turned out to be a total mismatch for Casey.
Really?
Yeah, see, Casey was deeply committed to her work and her clients. To her, a forced week away from that, it felt like a burden, not a reward.
So the company's assumption about what would motivate her was completely off base.
Totally. Casey's motivation was much higher quality than that. She was driven by this internal commitment to serving her clients well, and a spa week just didn't resonate with that.
That's a great example of how those well-intentioned external rewards can completely miss the mark. Fowler also tells this interesting story about Himesh, who was struggling with a lab technician who wasn't consistently wearing her safety glasses.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. So instead of just reprimanding her or writing her up, resorting to those external pressures,
Right.
Himesh took a different approach. He sat down with her and had a real, honest conversation.
And what did he discover?
Well, he discovered that her resistance to wearing the safety glasses wasn't defiance or carelessness.
Okay.
She was actually a single mother and deeply concerned about lab safety, ensuring that she could return home safely to her child every evening.
That makes sense.
Yeah. In fact, she even had suggestions for more stringent safety measures in certain situations.
So she wasn't against safety.
No, not at all. What she had an issue with was a particular safety rule that felt arbitrary and imposed in that specific context. It didn't make sense to her.
So, by taking the time to understand her perspective and connect the safety protocol to her deeper values, Himesh was able to shift her motivation.
Exactly. He helped her move from that feeling of being imposed upon to a place where she understood and embraced the safety measures.
Because it aligned with what she already cared about deeply.
Precisely. And that's a key takeaway, right? Understanding the why behind someone's behavior is crucial for fostering higher quality motivation. It's not about forcing compliance, it's about connecting to what already matters to them.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the heart of Fowler's framework. The 3 psychological needs she identifies as being at the core of optimal motivation: choice, connection, and competence. Can you explain these a bit further?
Sure. These 3 needs, they're presented as fundamental to human flourishing, regardless of our background or culture. They're essential for all of us. When these needs are consistently met, we naturally experience higher quality motivation, greater engagement, and overall well-being.
Okay, let's unpack them one by one. Let's start with choice, which is often referred to as autonomy. What's the essence of this need?
Choice. It's about our deep-seated need to feel a sense of control over our actions, our lives, to feel like we have options and that we are the initiators of our own behavior.
So not feeling like we're being controlled or micromanaged.
Exactly. Fowler uses this great analogy of a baby who's being fed. Even before they have the coordination to hold the spoon themselves, they instinctively want to be in control. They reach for the spoon, try to grab it. And when that sense of control is taken away, you often see resistance, even in a baby.
That's so true. They want to do it themselves even if they make a mess.
Exactly. And it's not just babies, right? This need for autonomy, for choice, it stays with us throughout our lives. And she also highlights this fascinating research by Dr. Brandon Irwin on sports coaches.
Okay, tell me about this research.
So Irwin found that when coaches are constantly giving verbal instructions and encouragement, their athletes actually often perform worse compared to when the coach is present, but less overtly directive.
Wait, so too much encouragement can be a bad thing?
That's what the research suggests. Irwin believes that all that verbal input, it actually shifts the athlete's focus and energy outward. It undermines their sense of choice, their internal drive. It's like the motivation becomes externalized, imposed by the coach.
So it's better to let athletes figure things out for themselves to some extent.
To a degree, yes. And what's even more fascinating is that when they added financial incentives on top of all that verbal coaching, it made the performance even worse.
So more rewards actually led to worse results.
In this case, yes. It's like that motivational junk food further eroded the athlete's sense of autonomy, their feeling of being in control.
So even well-intentioned efforts to motivate can backfire if they undermine that core need for choice.
Exactly. Think about it this way. Choosing what to eat for lunch versus having someone dictate your meal. Even if you end up with the same food, the feeling of having made the choice can make a big difference in how much you enjoy it.
That's a great analogy. Okay, let's move on to the second psychological need, connection. What's at the heart of this need?
Connection is about our deep-seated need to feel a sense of belonging, of genuine connection with others, in an environment where we don't feel like we have to constantly be on guard or watch our backs.
So feeling safe and supported, like we can be ourselves.
Exactly. It's also about aligning our goals and actions with our values, having a sense of purpose, and feeling like we're contributing to something bigger than ourselves.
Like our work has meaning beyond just a paycheck.
Exactly.
Huh.
Fowler emphasizes that this need operates on multiple levels: personal, interpersonal, even societal. She uses this great image of a toddler instinctively reaching up to grab your face and make eye contact.
We've all seen that, right?
It's this primal human need to connect, to be seen and recognized by others. And when that need is consistently met, it fuels our motivation, our desire to engage, to contribute.
And on the flip side, when that need isn't met, it can be really demotivating. Fowler tells a story about giving a keynote speech to a group of leaders in London who were, well, let's just say, not exactly engaged.
Yeah, she walked into this room,
Yeah.
and people were distracted, on their phones, not really present. Instead of just pushing through her prepared remarks, she did something really interesting.
What did she do?
She stopped her presentation and just started an open, honest conversation with the group about what was happening in the room.
What did they talk about?
Well, they talked about their anxieties about disconnecting from the digital world, about their sense that maybe none of them were really having their need for connection met in that moment. And she described it as this magical moment where they all kind of dropped their guard and connected on a human level.
So just acknowledging that unmet need was the key to breaking through the barrier.
Exactly. It wasn't about the content of the speech. It was about creating that sense of shared human experience of connection. And Fowler also talks about this concept of compensatory need satisfaction.
Compensatory need satisfaction. What's that?
It's when we try to substitute for that lack of genuine connection by pursuing external things. Like, imagine someone who feels isolated at work. So they try to compensate by amassing a ton of social media friends or constantly chasing promotions or status symbols.
So they're trying to fill that void with external validation.
Exactly. And while those things might provide a temporary boost, they don't actually address the underlying longing for real, authentic connection.
They're not getting that deeper sense of belonging and purpose.
Right. And as leaders, it's our responsibility to create environments where people can experience that genuine connection, where they feel cared about, where they care about others, and where they feel like their work has meaning and contributes to a larger purpose.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's move on to the third psychological need. Competence. What's so important about feeling competent?
Competence is about our need to feel effective, to demonstrate our skills and mastery, and to experience growth and learning over time. It's that sense of, hey, I can do this, I'm good at this, and I'm getting even better.
So it's not just about being good at something, it's about the feeling of growing and developing our abilities.
Exactly. And Fowler points out how damaging it can be when organizations cut training and development budgets, especially during tough economic times.
Because it sends the message that learning and growth aren't valued.
Exactly. It limits people's opportunities to develop their skills and feel more competent. Similarly, when only managers are offered training and development opportunities, it can undermine the growth and motivation of individual contributors.
So investing in people's development is actually investing in their motivation.
Absolutely. And she suggests this really simple but powerful practice.
Hmm.
At the end of each day, ask yourself not just, what did I achieve today, but also, what did I learn today? How did I grow?
I love that. It shifts the focus from just outcomes to the process of learning and development. Okay, so we've got these three fundamental needs: choice, connection, and competence. Fowler then talks about shifting out of overdrive and the importance of self-regulation. How does all of this fit together?
So Fowler contrasts this traditional idea called drive theory, which mainly focuses on our basic biological needs, like hunger or thirst, with her psychological needs-based perspective. Drive theory suggests that our motivation decreases once a need is satisfied.
Okay.
But anti-drive theory, which aligns with the psychological needs framework, suggests the opposite.
Meaning?
It says that when our needs for choice, connection, and competence are met, it actually leads to more motivation.
So it's not like, okay, I'm full, I don't need to eat anymore.
Right. It's more like, I'm really good at this now and I want to keep getting better. It feeds that desire to engage and grow.
That makes a lot of sense. But what about overdrive? Where does that come in?
Fowler argues that things like constant pressure to perform, reliance on those external rewards, and anything that undermines our sense of competence, it can create this state of overdrive.
Like we're running on fumes.
Exactly. And it's not sustainable. Our psychological needs are under threat.
Okay. And self-regulation is the antidote to overdrive.
In a way, yes. She defines self-regulation as the ability to mindfully manage our feelings, thoughts, values, and purpose in a way that allows us to sustain positive effort over time.
So it's about having that inner strength and resilience to stay focused and engaged even when things get tough.
Exactly. And she uses the classic marshmallow experiment to illustrate the power of self-regulation.
Oh yeah, the experiment where they give kids a marshmallow and tell them they can have two if they wait.
Right. And the kids who were able to delay gratification, the ones with higher quality self-regulation, tended to be more successful later in life.
Interesting. So being able to manage our impulses and stay focused on longer-term goals is a key skill for success.
Absolutely. And Fowler points out that the workplace environment plays a huge role in fostering self-regulation.
Meaning?
Well, employees are constantly assessing their surroundings, right? They're looking for cues about whether their environment is reliable, safe, and trustworthy. A workplace that consistently supports these qualities, it's much more likely to cultivate high-quality self-regulation in its employees.
So creating a psychologically safe and supportive environment is essential for helping people develop those self-regulation skills.
Exactly. And Fowler also brings in this idea of mindfulness.
Mindfulness, how does that relate to motivation?
Well, in this context, mindfulness is about cultivating present moment awareness. It's about observing our thoughts, feelings, and surroundings without judgment.
Okay.
Fowler argues that a lack of mindfulness can actually contribute to those less optimal motivational outlooks, the disinterested, external, and imposed states.
Because we're not really in touch with what's driving our behavior.
Right. And when we're feeling overwhelmed and not mindful, we might just check out, become fixated on external validation, or feel like we're victims of circumstance.
So mindfulness is about being aware of those inner states and making conscious choices.
Exactly. And she even points out that the low-quality energy we get from those less optimal motivations, it can become addictive.
Addictive? Like what?
Like the adrenaline rush from anger, or that intense drive to win at all costs, even if it means sacrificing relationships or our own well-being.
So even negative energy can be a kind of fuel, but it's not sustainable in the long run.
Right. And she shares that in her workshops, when people take the time to mindfully reflect on how those three needs, choice, connection, and competence, are being met or not met in relation to a specific goal, they often experience a shift in their motivation.
So just by becoming aware of those needs, they start to feel more motivated.
Often, yes. They realize they might have more choices than they thought, that the goal might actually align with their values, or that there are opportunities for growth and learning embedded within the goal itself.
It's about seeing things from a different perspective. And Fowler introduces this idea of the MVPs of high-quality self-regulation: mindfulness, values, and purpose.
Right. Those are the key ingredients for developing that inner strength and resilience. She also tells this really interesting story about a guy named Mohammedan who was participating in one of her workshops.
Okay, what happened?
So they were playing the simple heads or tails game, and the grand prize was an iPad mini. And Mohammedan, he really wanted to win. In fact, he admitted to cheating to get that iPad.
Wow, so the prize really got to him
It did. And afterwards, he felt so conflicted about it that he wanted to return the iPad.
because he realized he'd gone against his values.
Exactly. But instead of just accepting the iPad back, Fowler recognized a powerful teachable moment. Mohammedan bravely shared his experience with the whole group, talking about his intense drive to win and his underlying desire for recognition and status. And it sparked this amazing conversation about how easily our focus on external rewards can overshadow our deeper values and motivations.
So it wasn't really about the iPad itself. It was about what it represented to him.
Exactly. And the group then talked about how they could consciously use mindfulness, their values, and their sense of purpose to cultivate more genuine and lasting motivation.
That's a great example of how sometimes our behavior isn't really about the surface level stuff. It's about those deeper needs that are driving us. Now, Fowler goes on to offer a lot of practical advice in the chapter titled, What Does Work? She starts by saying that leaders shouldn't just ask people what motivates you. Why does she say that's a mistake?
Because it often leads to superficial answers. People might say they're motivated by money or recognition, but those are often just surface level desires.
They're not getting to the root of their motivation.
Right. And what's more, leaders can actually unintentionally sabotage their team's motivation through their actions. Things like relying too heavily on incentives, applying constant pressure, micromanaging, or using controlling language. All of these can undermine those three basic psychological needs.
So it's not just about what we say, but about how we create the environment.
Exactly. So instead of just asking what motivates you, Fowler suggests that we focus on creating an environment that supports choice, connection, and competence.
Okay, so let's get practical. What are some specific things leaders can do to encourage choice?
Well, one of the biggest things is to let go of the fear that people can't handle having more choices.
That control thing again.
Right. So instead of dictating every detail, try using more open language, presenting deadlines as information rather than demands, and involving people in decision-making whenever possible.
So it's about empowering people, giving them a sense of ownership.
Exactly. Fowler gives this great example from her publisher, Barrett Kohler, who communicates deadlines as essential information for achieving shared goals. It creates a sense of partnership and collaboration, not just top-down control.
Okay, so that's choice. What about connection? How can leaders deepen the sense of connection within their teams?
Well, it starts with demonstrating genuine compassion and empathy. People need to feel seen and valued for who they are.
Not just as cogs in a machine.
Right. It's also about aligning individual tasks and goals with people's values and sense of purpose. Help people connect what they do each day to a larger, more meaningful mission. And try to replace reliance on those external motivators with an emphasis on creating meaning in the work itself.
So it's about finding that intrinsic motivation, the joy in the work itself.
Exactly. She tells this really touching story about a guy named Sonny who initially thought that money was his primary motivator. But through a deeper conversation, he realized that his true motivation stemmed from a profound sense of gratitude for the sacrifices his parents made to support his education.
So it was about connection, about honoring his parents' legacy.
Precisely. And that realization gave him a whole new perspective on his work. It became about more than just a paycheck.
Okay, and finally, what about competence? How can leaders help people develop that sense of mastery and effectiveness?
Well, it starts with helping people feel like they can actually succeed in their roles, provide clear expectations, the right tools and resources, and ongoing support.
Set them up for success.
Exactly. And then create a culture that values continuous learning and development. Encourage experimentation, provide opportunities for growth, and celebrate both successes and failures as learning opportunities.
So it's about fostering a growth mindset.
Exactly. And instead of just giving people the answers, teach them how to solve problems themselves. Guide them through the process, ask thought-provoking questions, and empower them to find their own solutions.
Give them the fishing rod, not just the fish.
Exactly. And she tells a great story about a construction company supervisor who, instead of reprimanding an employee who was consistently late, had a conversation with the whole team and allowed them to come up with a flexible solution that worked for everyone.
So he empowered them to solve the problem themselves.
And in doing so, he fostered both connection and a sense of collective competence.
Okay, so it all comes back to those three needs: choice, connection, and competence.
They're the foundation of optimal motivation.
Now, Fowler also talks about rethinking leadership in the context of today's rapidly changing world. What are some of the key challenges she highlights?
Well, she points out that the workforce is changing. People are prioritizing autonomy, flexibility, meaningful work, and their own well-being more than ever before.
We've seen that with the rise of remote work and the Great Resignation.
Exactly. And traditional command and control leadership styles just aren't cutting it anymore.
So what does Fowler suggest?
She uses this interesting change activity analogy. Imagine trying to push a large object.
Okay.
If you're pushing against someone else's resistance, it's going to be really difficult.
Right.
But if you're both pushing in the same direction, it's much easier.
So it's about alignment, about working together.
Exactly. And she argues that when people's psychological needs are met, they're much more likely to be adaptable and open to change. They're pushing in the same direction as the organization.
That makes sense. So how does this apply to things like hybrid work arrangements, which have become so common?
Well, Fowler contrasts Elon Musk's approach to remote work at Tesla,
Hmm.
the whole back to the office or you're fired thing, with a much more flexible and employee-centric approach at another company.
So one was very rigid and the other was more adaptable.
Exactly. And Musk's approach seemed to disregard the need for both choice and connection, while the other company actively surveyed its employees to understand their needs and preferences.
So it's about listening to people, understanding what matters to them.
Exactly. And then communicating clearly about the rationale behind decisions.
So it's not just about flexibility for its own sake. It's about creating an environment that supports people's needs.
Precisely. And Fowler also talks about the need to rethink goal setting and performance feedback.
Okay, how so?
Well, with goal setting, she suggests shifting from what she calls low-quality goals, which are often driven by external validation, things like social recognition, image, or material success, to high-quality goals that are more intrinsically aligned with things like personal growth, meaningful relationships, community contribution, health and well-being, and continuous learning.
So goals that are more aligned with our values and purpose.
Exactly. And she uses the example of Stephen Curry, the basketball superstar. He's obviously incredibly driven, but his focus is on team success, not just personal accolades.
That's a great example. And what about feedback?
With feedback, Fowler suggests flipping the process. Have people proactively seek feedback rather than just receiving it from their managers.
So it becomes more of a two-way conversation.
Right. And when giving feedback, focus on providing objective information rather than subjective judgments. And use language that supports autonomy rather than control.
So instead of saying, you did a great job, you might say, I noticed that you.
Exactly. And avoid personal praise or criticism, which can create a dependence on external validation.
It's about providing information that helps people grow, not just judging their performance.
Right. And she also talks about the use of gamification and rewards in a way that supports those three psychological needs.
Okay, how can gamification be used effectively?
Well, too often, gamification is just about winning and earning rewards, which can actually undermine intrinsic motivation.
It becomes all about the external stuff.
Exactly. So Fowler suggests designing gamification in a way that supports choice, connection, and competence.
So make it fun and engaging, but not just about the prize at the end.
Right. And with rewards, she says to view them as a last resort.
So don't rely on them as the primary motivator.
Exactly. She gives an example of a company that initially paid managers to have regular one-on-one meetings with their employees. But over time, those meetings became so valuable that they continued even after the financial incentive was removed.
So the intrinsic value of the meetings took over.
Right. And she also talks about a grocery store that gives customers tokens for using reusable bags, which they can then donate to a local charity.
So it's a reward, but it's also connected to a sense of purpose and community.
Exactly. And finally, Fowler delves into the topic of trust, which is obviously crucial for any healthy work environment.
Okay, how does trust relate to motivation?
Well, she emphasizes that trust is a two-way street. Our willingness to trust others is directly influenced by our own motivation.
Okay.
And if a leader is operating from a place of distrust, they're more likely to micromanage, control, and undermine their employees' sense of autonomy, belonging, and competence.
So a lack of trust creates a negative cycle.
Exactly. And she talks about the importance of creating a psychologically safe environment where people feel comfortable taking risks, sharing ideas, and being vulnerable.
So trust is essential for fostering that sense of connection and psychological safety.
Absolutely. And Fowler also highlights the work of Alvar Pierra, who has done some really interesting research on employee engagement.
And what did Pierre find?
He found that true, sustainable engagement is a direct result of optimal motivation, which is cultivated by consistently meeting those three psychological needs: choice, connection, and competence.
So it all circles back to those core needs.
It always does.
Now, Fowler also has a chapter titled Leader, Heal Thyself, which is pretty powerful. Why does she emphasize the importance of the leader's own motivation?
Well, she makes the point that leaders need to understand and manage their own motivation before they can effectively guide and inspire others.
So it's about leading by example.
In a way, yes. And she shares some great stories of leaders who have done this internal work.
Like what?
Well, there's Amber Barnes, who realized that her fear of vulnerability was preventing her from connecting authentically with her team. Beth Scalone created a code word system to hold her staff accountable while also respecting their need for autonomy. Brock Weatherup actually shared a personal crisis with his.